I will pass it on to Cece and Laura.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Laura Dries. I work with Glenbrook Partners and am delighted to be here today on the first day of the 2021 Mojo Loop convening. I know there's already been a fantastic lineup of presentations already today, and I'm hoping that we can continue that with our talk on scheme governance and real-time retail payment systems. Now, I know that Mojo Loop is largely a technology-focused community, but why we wanted to speak about scheme governance today is that, of course, technology doesn't exist in a vacuum, needs strong business connections to root it in application and use. And what we'll be seeing over today is how scheme governance is really that essential foundation of any payment scheme. And what I hope that folks can take away from our discussion is a better understanding on how scheme governance influences payment schemes and, of course, the implications for Mojo Loop. Just quickly, some introductions. And before I even do that, let me just say that our colleague Elizabeth McQuarrie was originally supposed to be on this panel, but unfortunately has had a conflict come up and can't be here today. So I am here in her stead. Like I said, my name is Laura Dries. I'm a senior associate with Glenbrook. I've been here about 6 months. And prior to this, I come from a background in international financial inclusion. So I worked in microfinance lending for about 5 years, and then on the technology side for a year. And so I've been following Mojo Loop at a distance for some time now, and am delighted to now be getting a little bit more involved. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Cece Northrup. Let me just ask Cece to come off mute and introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cece Northrup. It's nice to see you all again. I'm a senior engagement manager at Glenbrook Partners and have worked for close to a decade now in financial inclusion and real-time payments. Delighted to be here, as Laura said, and I may have to go off video. I'm having a little bit of an unstable internet connection today for some reason, so I apologize if that's the case, but please still listen in. Thanks.
Thank you, Cece. Just a little bit about Glenbrook for those of you that don't know us. We are a payments strategy and consulting and education firm focused exclusively on the payment space. So we partner with clients both in the US, where we're located, and also all around the world through our global practice to help them derive value through payments. And we're a strong believer in that efficient and inclusive financial services are vital to economic growth. And so our sweet spot is when we can partner with clients to help them achieve those efficiencies and promote financial inclusion. Today, I'm going to be walking us through an intro to scheme governance, and then we'll be sharing 3 common governance models and discussing their alignment to the level 1 project principles. And lastly, we'll end with some implications for Mojo Loop. And I believe for that section, we'll be pulling in a few familiar faces from the community to comment on that. So to dive right in, I first want to just align on a few key terms. And these are terms that, you may or may not see different definitions of, depending who you ask. We're not saying that our definitions are the only ones. We just want to be clear about how we're using them today. So when we're talking about a payment system, that is the system that facilitates monetary transactions between parties. And it's comprised of the 3 components you see below: the payment scheme, the operator, and the platform. The payment scheme is the set of rules, standards, and policies that outlines major payment system decisions. So you can think of this as, in the scheme rules, you'll have decisions such as who can participate in the payment scheme. Is it banks only, or is it also non-banks? It'll be the pricing between participants within the scheme, what type of transactions a scheme can send. Is it, credit push only or also debit pull? And this is also where a lot of the governance aspects sit. Then we have the operator. So this is the entity that manages the payment system platform. So manages the day-to-day of the payment system and of course is abiding by scheme rules. And then lastly, we have the platform itself, which is the technology or the processing entity that is routing transactions from one digital financial service provider to another, and may also provide additional features and functions such as directory services, or as we're seeing more recently, fraud management. All three of these components combine to form the payment system as a whole. And while all payment systems have these three core components, I do just want to be clear that depending on the payment system, these components may be provided all by separate entities, or they could all be provided by the same entity as well. So you can have one entity that's acting as operator, who's also providing the technology, that also may be managing the scheme, or those could all be done by distinct entities. Just to ground that in some real world examples here, if we look at the UK faster payment system, the payment scheme is UK faster payments. So again, that's the collection of scheme rules, business policies, and standards that make UK faster payments what it is. For anyone who's interested, the faster payment scheme rules are available online. Anyone can look at them. The operator is an entity called Pay UK, and Pay UK is not only the operator of UK faster payments, but also operates two other payment schemes in the UK, I think BACS and ICS as well. And then the platform is provided by Vocalink. So Vocalink is providing the central infrastructure, which is doing the routing of faster payments transactions. Moving over to Mexico, the SPAY system, which stands for the Interbank Electronic Payment System, which is one of the first real-time systems out there. And the payment scheme is SPAY, so there are scheme rules for SPAY. The operator is the Banco de Mexico, which is the central bank, and the platform is proprietary, but it's provided by Banco de Mexico as well. Then in Tanzania, which is an example we're all pretty familiar with, we have the TIPS, Tanzania Instant Payment System, as the scheme, the operator as Bank of Tanzania, and the platform as proprietary Bank of Tanzania, of course, leveraging Mojo Loop. Cece, anything you want to chime in on before I go on?
No, that's great, Laura. Thank you.
Okay. So diving into governance itself. So we're defining scheme governance as the collection of management approaches, decisions, and oversight functions within the payment scheme. So largely, we're talking about what exists in the payment scheme itself. So within the payment scheme rules, there's going to be governance components which define, for example, who has the right to approve new participants to the payment scheme, who has the right to amend or propose new rules for the payment scheme. But there can also be governance functions that are existing outside of the payment scheme itself. So there can be governance aspects of the entity that manages the scheme. Also, with oversight functions, sometimes there are governance aspects with the central bank, which can sit outside of the scheme itself. And why we really want to talk about governance today is that it's so essential. It is the foundational structure that allows payment schemes to set objectives and to operate. And it really sets the tone for everything else that occurs in the scheme. So you can imagine a payment scheme with a much more narrow governance structure that perhaps only allows a very few stakeholders to direct the scheme, direct scheme rules, et cetera, might look very different from a payment scheme with a much more open governance structure that allows broad participation from all direct and indirect participants. Also, payment scheme governance has the ability to either promote or deter financial inclusion, with certain models lending themselves to a more pro-poor structure. Though, as we'll see throughout the talk today, all models can achieve financial inclusion goals with proper planning and commitment. Now, I want to talk about 3 governance principles that, if followed, have the ability to promote financial inclusion in real-time payment schemes. So my guess is that most everyone on this call are familiar with the Level 1 project principles, but for those that aren't, the Level 1 project is a multi-year initiative from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that seeks to understand how payment systems worldwide can drive inclusive growth in their economies by bringing the poor into the digital economy. And through the multi-year, multi-country study, there's been a collection of best practices or principles that, if followed, can help promote financial inclusion. There are 3 principles that deal with scheme governance, and those are the ones listed here. The first is equal ownership. And so by that, we mean that the scheme provides direct participants, which might include banks, but also might include non-banks, provide them with equal ownership opportunities within scheme governance and payment system operations. Then we have participant engagement. So this means that both direct and indirect participants are provided with a format, formal mechanisms to provide input on the direction of the scheme. So this could be in the form of, participant forums where direct and indirect participants have the ability to promote scheme rules amendments or to voice their opinion on scheme rules and the direction of the scheme. And lastly, we have ensuring a pro-poor posture. So by that, we mean that the payment scheme is operating as a not-for-loss entity, or such as a utility that's not focused on profit maximization. And Susie, anything else to add on that before I turn it over to you?
No, that's a great setup. Thanks, Laura.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, let me turn over to Cece to walk us through the next section.
Thanks, everyone. Next slide, please. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So when we think about payment system governance, one of the things we explored is what are the models that we're seeing in market today? And we researched 17 different payment schemes and governance structures across 13 countries and regions. This research took place about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And in doing so, we surfaced 3 primary governance structures that support payment schemes. Those are the 3 in front of you. They are the central bank-led model, commercial-led model, and association-led model. At the very basic level, the central bank model is, of course, a model that is led by a central bank or government entity, such that that entity is the entity that has authority over the payment scheme rules. A commercial-led entity, likewise, is a model where a commercial organization or entity has authority over the payment scheme rules. And finally, the last model is an association-led model where a group with a shared purpose, and sometimes these groups are defined in different ways, ultimately has authority over the payment scheme rules. We explored the extent to which these models aligned or impeded or supported the best practices that Laura just mentioned. So Laura, if we can go to the next slide, please. What we found is that there are benefits and risks to these various structure types. Now, before I dive in, I want to acknowledge one very important thing. Certainly, each model lends itself to supporting or impeding each of these components. That being said, they're not restricted to doing so. So one of the important things to acknowledge is that any of these models can achieve any of the goals or best practices as outlined on the left. They just have a tendency to support or thwart. So for example, what we find is that the association-led model is best suited to naturally support both participant engagement and ensuring a pro-poor posture. It's neutral to ownership structure. Typically, we find that associations, historically, at least to date, are made up of like entities. So we see a lot of bank-owned associations. We see fewer bank and non-bank owned associations. Switching to commercial-led, I'm working from right to left. We find that the commercial-led model in its structure, in its organic structure, does not lend itself to support these best practices or components of financial inclusion. However, again, want to acknowledge that this doesn't mean that it's not capable, and we'll walk through a couple examples in a minute. Finally, the central bank-led model is very well suited to support ensuring a pro-poor posture. It tends to be neutral on participant engagement, and it tends to impede equal ownership, largely because there is often no ownership opportunities within the central bank itself. So let's go to the next slide. Let's illustrate these a bit. So when we think about opportunities for ownership, again, circling back to the principle is that we want equal ownership opportunities for licensed financial institutions that have an opportunity to serve as direct participants in the payment scheme. A couple examples here for the SPAY, Banco de Mexico real-time payment scheme that Laura mentioned at the top of the hour. That is a central bank model-led scheme. As a result, they do not allow ownership over the scheme by participants, kind of inherent in their structure as a central bank. Meanwhile, juxtaposing that to the Payments Association of Namibia, the Payments Association of Namibia is an organization that supports national payment systems in Namibia, and they provide ownership as our most recent understanding suggests. They allow ownership opportunities to any licensed financial institution in the country, be that a licensed bank or a licensed non-bank. Before we switch gears, Laura, I just wanted to acknowledge one thing about ownership. Oftentimes we find that payment schemes are developed and then the types of participants who can join the scheme is expanded beyond the original remit. This creates a tricky situation where we find that the costs borne to set up and establish the scheme were not shared by all of those who now are direct participants. That's a tricky complexity that we want to acknowledge. So when we think about equal ownership opportunities by banks and non-banks or all licensed financial institutions who can serve as direct participants, it's important to recognize that that's most easy to establish when you're spinning something up new. This is why we suggest governance be a very intentional exercise to recognize the implications both at the start in terms of who has guidance over scheme rules, but also how your payment scheme is likely to evolve over time. Okay, next slide. So participant engagement, another important thing that we see with governance is to make sure that those institutions who are playing similar roles in our scheme, so serving as direct participants or indirect participants, able to hold transaction accounts of end users, we want those institutions to have equal engagement and equal say over the direction of the rules. And we want to make sure that everyone has a voice. We see examples that are, we see increasingly, I would say, across the board, organizations of all types, of all governance types, recognize the value of this and are making concerted efforts to engage their participant base, and actually extending that engagement beyond their direct participants to the point where they're engaging what I would call end user communities, like merchant communities. So we notice a global trend towards increased participant engagement, and we would continue to advocate for that, because what we find is it's just truly important to make sure that those voices are heard in rules writing. A couple examples to illustrate participant engagement. We see MasterCard has formal, direct, and indirect participant forums. For example, I think a merchant forum or acquire forum. We don't know the extent to which these forums allow for direct engagement on scheme rules, but they are an opportunity for voices to be heard. Similarly, we find PASA in South Africa, which is a rules-making authority for multiple schemes in South Africa, work pretty hard to engage their members and non-members through various structures. Again, we acknowledge that these engagements tend to take place both formally and informally. The trend towards formal is one that we'd support. Next slide, Laura. And lastly, to illustrate a few examples of ensuring a pro-poor posture. So one of the interesting things that we found with looking into whether a payment scheme and a governance structure supported a pro-poor posture was acknowledging that it often had little to do with legally how that entity was established. So we find both organizations that are structured as or formalized as for-profit entities and ones that are formalized as not-for-profit entities. We see both types of institutions engaging or creating an objective that is pro-poor, if you will. By pro-poor, we really mean to what extent does the pricing scheme enable very low costs between participants such that end user pricing is essentially zero or as low as possible. PDP in Peru is an example. The BIM scheme is intended to promote financial inclusion. It has very clearly stated that in its objectives of the payment scheme rules. PDP itself is established as a for-profit entity, and as such, they actually have found themselves right in this dynamic where the institution itself, established as a for-profit, does not necessarily align or disable it from having a pro-poor payment scheme posture. The Interac scheme in Canada is another interesting example. Interac used to be a corporation and an association. Now it is established as a for-profit corporation. That being said, it is very clear that in their communications and their objectives that they intend to maintain a very low cost revenue model such that the cost per transaction for their licensed participants remains very low. As such, this is an important example of the fact that a commercial-led model like Interac is established today can maintain a pro-poor posture and exhibit the level 1 best practices, even though it is established as a commercial-led model, which, as mentioned, in and of itself naturally lends itself to impede that principle. Laura, anything else to add on these examples?
No, I don't think so, Cece. Thank you.
Okay, great. So lastly, we want to acknowledge that, again, most of you are familiar with the Level 1 project. There are a host of other scheme design principles for real-time payments that promote inclusion and scale. We looked at the different governance models and compared those to the principles to also explore to what extent those models support or impede other scheme principles. And we found a mixed bag. Ultimately, what surfaced is that both the central bank and association-led models tend to further enable many of the L1P scheme design principles more naturally. Again, we want to acknowledge that this does not mean that any of the models are not able to support these principles. They just more naturally lend themselves to that. A couple examples to surface that or illustrate that is that in terms of creating a payment scheme that's inclusive and low cost, that is intended for scale and interoperability, we found that both the central bank and association-led models may be better positioned to support these principles. Next slide. Lastly, in our research, as I mentioned, we researched about 20 different payment schemes and governance models of those schemes. Other benefits and challenges surfaced during that research that we wanted to acknowledge, right? We didn't scope the research solely to the L1P best practices. Here's an outline of a few of those potential benefits and downsides. For example, within the commercial-led model, I think it's important to acknowledge that some of the benefits in talking with folks that surfaced is that in a commercial-led model, the ability to invest in innovation and to pivot quickly is more accessible relative to, say, an association-led model where consensus really drives decision making, and as such, it can sometimes be difficult to most efficiently figure out where to invest money in shared infrastructure. Similarly, the central bank-led model, a couple of potential benefits that surface that are worth pointing out today include policy alignments and mandates of behavior. So central banks, of course, are our primary regulators in country. As such, they have a very overarching perspective on the needs of the payments needs in country, and they can very clearly drive the rules of the scheme and the governance structure of the scheme in a direction that is reflective of the needs of the country. In addition to that, they can mandate behavior of the participants and institutions in country to best align with what the payment scheme is intended to achieve. I think I see from Adrian a note that additional challenge with central bank is that financial inclusion is not a part of the central bank's mandate. That's interesting. I would say increasingly we have seen that central banks have created national financial inclusion strategies that are closely linked with their national payment systems vision. So Adrian, I'd be curious to hear more from you on that. I think that could actually be a benefit of the central bank-led model rather than a challenge. All this to say, I think there's interesting discussions to be had here, right, about the benefits and risks of each of these approaches. All right, next slide, Laura. So a couple implications for Mojo Loop, and then we'll actually hand it over to Steve and Leslie Ann. Governance, as we said, we kicked off, it's very cross-cutting and essential as an essential structure to influencing the decisions that are made for the scheme, both in terms of the business rules that are reflected by the scheme rules, as well as the technical design. And I think the latter is really where we want to acknowledge the role of governance and its implications for Mojo Loop, right? If ultimately the entities who own or have a say in scheme rules make certain decisions, that could lend itself or impede itself to a Mojo Loop like model. So I think it's important that we as a community recognize the extent to which the governance models influence how we can engage with organizations, and also continue to stay aware of the different models that are taking shape in various countries and regions. Next slide. And before we pose a few questions, we also wanted to acknowledge, just regardless of the positioning, I think it's important that, Mojo Loop as an open source software community is working to create software and services that illustrate financial inclusion best practices. In addition, governance models should be a deliberate consideration as we work with various teams and countries. There are opportunities to build in financial inclusion objectives and opportunities to scale within the governance model itself. As such, we would continue to advocate to pay attention to this. Nevertheless, we also want to acknowledge that different structures are suitable for different environments, and so every country or context will vary in their circumstance and vary in their needs. Okay, last slide. So some ongoing considerations for Mojo Loop as we continue to think about governance. What do we need to do as a community to ensure we can design and build from multiple governance models? And how and to what extent do we advocate for models that are best suited for financial inclusion? So these are considerations I pose that we continue to think about. And I think we also can consider how these are reflected or aligned with country policy. And actually that is the thread to which I want to hand off to Steve and Leslie Ann, who will kind of elevate this conversation about governance into a national country context to think about policy decisions. So Leslie Ann, should I hand it over to you at this time?
It would be great if Cece and Laura stayed around, because I think actually it would be lovely to have a little bit of a conversation about what just happened, what we just learned, what we thought about in terms of Mojo Loop and Mojo Loop schemes in that. Do you know, is Emma joining us as well, Steve? Or
yes, she's online.
So I guess really the floor is open to a question that I have is, how do we go from level 1 principles are awesome to getting some decisions made, getting some governance models impossible? And I think that's even a question from our community. We want to do stuff, but how do we go about starting this? Any reactions, any thoughts? Steve, you and I.
Yeah, we talked about this quite a bit. And I think this leads into something that Ahmed was talking about that point that I made him try to repeat on his nice journey there about making sure that the regulators are a part of the design process and are actually in that design process. And I think this is where we very often lose people, is they hear, hey, level 1, this is great, I want this. But then the next question is, yeah, either question is, what do I do about it? Or, cool, I have now said publicly that I want this. It's now up to somebody else to make sure that gets implemented. And the number of entities and people between a regulator saying, I want this level 1 thing, and the implementation of that is so vast that by the time the regulator wakes up and says, whoa, that's not what I asked for, it's way too late. They're already way down a procurement process. They're already way down a design process, and we've missed our opportunity. And so for me, there's definitely something that needs to come after this. And I do think that's why I really loved what Ahmed said, was I think it's that payment scheme design process, or the payment design process, which does need to be a collaborative thing between the regulators, the rule builders, the policymakers, and the technologists, so that when policymakers and regulators are saying, I want this, somebody can answer the questions to say, oh, okay, well, so the implications on what you should ask for from a contractor is going to be asking for this, this, and this. And that translation between what does the policymaker want and how do you ask a technology company for that is a missing link that I wish we could focus on.
Yeah, if I could add just one thing that I think is often missing in that process that Steve just described it's thinking too much about what the end product is going to look like rather than thinking through there may be various scenarios that are all in a sense equally good and have trade-offs, right? And if there were a way early on, and there are ways, but if we find successful ways of thinking rather than, so we have in one sense, this idea of providing something to government, and that looks like a recommendation, right? I think we ought to change our view and say what we're doing is we're trying to provide options. And our job is to help navigate them around those options. It empowers the regulator, like it's your choice, but the process of getting to those choices is about best practice, it's about standards. And what I love about L1P is all of those options can be reflections of what those principles are, right? It's just about choosing the one that works for you. And we may have opinions about which one works better, but if we're cool with any one of the three, then ultimately it's a win, right? We're talking about trade-offs on all sides. So I think Steve is absolutely right. I would just think about it as options as well.
That's a big part of our conversation in the product council is how do we make sure that it's about options, 100%. One of the other questions from the attendees, Jill has asked, cost of these things is very different in country by country, and it really affects what a model or design for ProPer can be. Any thoughts about how this gets done in reality, the cost side of things?
One of the things that, this is something that we talk about all the time, as you know, in the product council, is that the aim is minimizing cost. And while it's different, I do think, I think there is a certain amount of right setting your expectations in terms of how many transactions and what kind of robustness of system you're looking for and what use cases and what it is you're trying to do. I think that's one way of looking at different cost features for different people. But I do think that going back to those challenges that we talked about before of setting the right conversation, really separating cost from price is a challenge that I have getting people to think about, of saying, no, Mojolip and what we're trying to do is just minimize cost. The price is whatever you want, but we want to minimize cost, both implementation cost and ongoing costs, to a point that you can charge the price scheme that you want, giving you as many options as you can. And I think that's where we have a difficulty in the conversation, is getting people to separate the cost from the price. So which one are you talking about there, the cost or the price?
I think we as Mojolip have only got influence on the price. We don't have any control of the price. We have control of the cost. And so I'm always talking about the cost. Cece, you made some interesting points in the chat. Do you want to jump on and say those to the room?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a smart distinction to differentiate between cost and price. Certainly those, we don't want to have, kind of a cost plus pricing model, right? So as a result, I think if you start with the objective before you even consider the build and the costs associated with the build, if you start with an objective that's pro-poor and an intention to serve end users at a very low cost, you can build your strategy and ultimately get a place to a break-even ultimately get to a place of a break-even. Let me rephrase. I think that if you start with an objective that's pro-poor, you are setting yourself up most likely to make choices in your development of the scheme and of the platform and of the design that lend themselves to low-cost choices that are ultimately also successful in achieving your goals, such that you can provide low end user pricing in a way that also allows for break even within a 10-year time horizon.
Well, sorry, Cece, I obviously completely agree with you. I think that there are 80 people on this call, and probably about 40 of them that I know that spend their entire lives trying to think of specific design choices to minimize cost. And I think my challenge is, I'm not sure that between the policymaker's decision to minimize costs and the decision that the people actually, I'm not sure that, I think that there is something lost in translation of, you can say that, you're absolutely right. Start with that as a policy objective we have to minimize costs so they can be pro-poor. But along the way, I think that specific decisions are very often made that don't lend to that, because I think that there aren't I don't know that we have this wide capacity out there in the world of people who know what those specific design decisions should be to minimize cost. And I could be wrong, but I feel like I see a lot of RFPs that we just say, yeah, you're not really necessarily setting yourself up for that low cost thing you're asking for.
Steve, if I can add an angle to that, I don't think governments, to the point made before about different markets have different costs, I don't think we've got a tracker to say what is low cost, right? You know, how do you know you're veering in the wrong direction, particularly when you're thinking of network effects where early users might be more middle income users. And so they're a bit less price sensitive, perhaps. And, you know, I mean, and I think you're absolutely right. What would be great, and this is, I think, part of the conversation you and I had, is in these engagements with government in governments as they're designing these things, you know, keeping close tabs and pointing at those points to be like, that is where the cost can go either way, right? And then what we don't often have is enough data to inform, you know, where are the limits? Are we building in floors? Are we establishing ceilings? Is there a feedback loop? And also where government's intentions can be counterproductive. If you look at Nigeria, making cash withdrawals at ATM free and then setting a cap on interchange on card transactions cannibalized each other. You just encouraged more cash by withdrawing from ATMs rather than encouraging the use of cards. So saying lowering cost was actually insufficient. You'd actually want to remove that interchange cap, yep, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive to what the intent was, but there was no one guiding them in that process to say, hold on a minute. So I think you're right. There is something missing in that process.
And we've been thinking a little bit at the foundation about how might we help with simulation of different scenarios using open source along the way. It's certainly one of the things that we're considering in terms of how we might think about rules as code and regulation as code. And to that point, I actually was curious about how that might segue nicely to our next session, because I think we've run out of time. I'm sure that Simeon will tell us that we've run out of time very shortly. And I think our next session is very much focused on how do we think about innovation in rules and regulation. Thank you guys. Thank you for jumping on for another few minutes.
Cece, Laura, do you guys want to wrap up?
I think Leslie Ann did a better job than we could. So over to you, Simeon.
Thank you so much for that session. To Cece, Laura, Leslie Ann, Steve, and Ahmed. Again, please leave us your comments using the poll there.